Rare access for the World Health Organization to the last functioning hospital in northern Gaza. They say it's now collapsed. 80 patients remain here, sheltering in the church on site. Pews are now hospital beds. Prayers are for water, food and pain medication. But at El Ahli Hospital, they go unanswered. The WHO says hospitals in the north are now hospices where people wait to die. It's not safe to bury the bodies.
They don't have specialists, they don't have surgeons, they don't have power, they don't have water, they don't have food. We've brought some medicines and medical supplies today. They're doing their best with a very small team of only about 10 clinical staff left at this hospital.
Down the road, the director of the Al Auda hospital had warned for weeks his facility was under attack. Here, after an Israeli shelling, he pledges to keep it running. But days ago, he was arrested.
After the airstrike on the hospital, they entered and arrested the hospital director, Dr. Ahmed Mahana. The next day, they arrested 12 people from the hospital staff.
Hospital staff say they've been under siege for 16 days. 240 people are still trapped inside without food and water.
Tanks and snipers are still surrounding it from all sides. The staff members can't even move between the different hospital departments.
The IDF told us they've been operating in the area of the hospital but deny entering. They say they've arrested 13 alleged terror suspects, including the director, Dr. Mahana. In another part of Gaza, the IDF announced the discovery of a vast Hamas tunnel network. Holes in the ground leading to sophisticated underground networks, with rooms concealed behind blast doors. They claim to have found hideout apartments for the group's most senior leaders, including Yahya Sinwar and Ismail Haniyeh. The latter now in Cairo, trying to hash out a new ceasefire deal with Israel. But talks aren't moving. Israel isn't ready to stop. Hamas says there'll be no hostages released unless the war ends.
We've informed all parties about the clear and specific position that there will be no negotiation on the issue of prisoners before stopping the aggression. This position has been communicated to all parties and we have nothing to add to this.
Amidst the fighting, Gazans are starving. No one has enough to eat. The Foreign Secretary visited the Rafah border crossing today, while at the UN, the Security Council continued to try and reach a resolution to boost aid. And while David Cameron talked up the need for more of it, he wouldn't confirm if the UK would vote yes.
What we'll do is do what we think is right, but we're trying to build consensus for a resolution that will really make a difference. And it's got, there's still work to be done to get a resolution everyone can get behind that will get the aid in the right way. That's what we're looking for.
After days of talks, the sticking point is now who inspects it, the UN or Israel. That's of no help to Tahani, who says her children are dizzy with hunger. Yesterday, someone gave her a can of peas, the only food her family has.
And in an update just moments ago, Al Auda Hospital, featured in that report, says one of their staff was killed today on hospital grounds. Well, joining me now from Amman is Tamara Al-Rifai, who's the Director of External Relations and Communications at the UN's relief agency in Gaza. Tamara Al-Rifai, I wondered if you could reflect on the unfolding crisis in terms of the levels of hunger. What are you hearing and seeing?
I am hearing very similar stories to the one you just showed with Tahani. I was in Gaza last week, in fact, and one of my colleagues told me that in order for her to be able to feed her family, she is asking them to pretend it's the holy month of Ramadan and they can only eat once a day. And what they eat needs to remain very light in order for them not to feel too heavy at night and fast again the next morning. This is the kind of stories that I'm hearing from my staff. And in fact, that story you just showed about the 1 can of peas, I also heard it from families I interacted with in Gaza, who told me that indeed they are receiving some food from the UN, from UNRWA in particular, the largest UN agency in Gaza, but it's indeed 1 can of peas or beans every 3 or 4 days for families of 4 and 5 or 6 people.
So clearly, if that continues, a catastrophe is about to unfold.
Absolutely. And the catastrophe is either that people are going to die of hunger, that is, if they haven't died of the war, the bombings, or they can also start dying of diseases because of the overcrowding inside the shelters and the overcrowding right outside the shelters. So we've already started to see outbreaks of different diseases, respiratory, skin diseases, and also a couple of cases of hepatitis A. So it's dying in different ways for the people in Gaza now.
So will the opening of this aid corridor from Jordan make a difference? You know, is it coming soon enough to stave off this catastrophe you're talking about?
It is definitely not coming soon enough. We're over 70 days into this conflict with a trickle of aid going in every day with between 40 and 100 trucks of humanitarian assistance. Just for some perspective, Gaza has a population of 2.2 million people. That's, let's say, the populations of Birmingham, Leeds, and Liverpool together. 40 trucks is barely enough for one grocery store, one neighborhood Tesco. So unless there is really substantive aid going in, an increase, going back to the pre-war levels of 500 trucks per day, and unless these trucks contain also commercial goods that people can buy, the catastrophic situation in Gaza will reach apocalyptic magnitude.
So how then do you view Netanyahu's dismissal of a truce on the one hand, but also Hamas saying they wouldn't consider a partial release of hostages? They want a full ceasefire. I mean, that intransigence is heartbreaking, isn't it?
It is extremely heartbreaking that the politics are standing in the way of the survival of 2.2 million people in Gaza, the civilians, the women, the children, the sick people, the elderly. Our position at the UN, our position at UNRWA, as the largest humanitarian agency in Gaza, directly in contact with the community, is to say there needs to be an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and a flow of humanitarian assistance and commercial goods going in, and that this should not be conditioned by advancing in the political negotiations. Aid should not be made conditions to political negotiations by either party.
Tamar El-Rifai, thank you very much for joining us. Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Frank Lowenstein, who served as the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and Senior Advisor to the Secretary of State under President Obama. We were hearing there, Frank Lowenstein, about the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding and the sense that politics and that political breakdown is getting in the way of saving civilian lives. The UN Security Council has been negotiating for a month. I mean, that is costing civilian lives every day, isn't it? That failure to agree any kind of ceasefire resolution.
Yeah, and I think it's a big problem for the Biden administration. He's obviously under pressure domestically here to do something about the catastrophic humanitarian situation. And for us to be completely isolated at the United Nations, vetoing resolutions calling for increased humanitarian assistance, it's an untenable position for Biden to be in. And I think that's why you've seen a delay over the last few days as they have tried to find language that we could live with in order to allow this to pass. And obviously the Israelis have offered to a week-long humanitarian pause in return for the release of 40 hostages. So I think we're hoping that maybe those negotiations will gain some traction and make the resolution no longer necessary. But in any event, I think the biggest challenge for the United States is making clear to the Israelis that we're not going to tolerate this kind of continued indifference to the humanitarian suffering there. So I think underneath the outward vote, there's an underlying message to the Israelis that we're not going to continue to defend you if you're not going to take much more proactive steps to address the humanitarian problem.
But we heard Netanyahu flat out dismissing a truce. He's not listening to Biden, is he?
Well, what Biden's calling for is a humanitarian pause here. Bibi doesn't want an extended pause because, they think that will allow Hamas to stay in power. And I think that's consistent with where the Biden administration is at. I think what we're focused on is a shorter humanitarian pause in order to allow a really desperately needed humanitarian assistance. And so I'm not sure there's a big gap between where we are and where the Israelis are on that particular question.
So how do we get through this impasse at the UN? I mean, is there a way through it? For example, the concern seems to be about aid going in and whether weapons could be smuggled in. Is there a way through that stumbling block?
I would imagine there is. They seem to be haggling over the mechanism to inspect humanitarian assistance before it goes in to Gaza Strip. And I think if you look at the imperative that the Israelis are probably feeling from the United States to allow more humanitarian assistance in, I would imagine technical questions like how those goods get inspected could probably be resolved. I fear there's bigger issues there, though, which is that the Israelis are going to fight against anything at the United Nations that isn't what they view as balanced between their role and Hamas's role. And I think that's a very difficult position for the United States to defend in light of the fact that the entire world pretty much sees this from the other perspective.
And Israel seems, determined to carry on fighting. So how much longer has Israel got before the US loses patience and starts to withdraw support in the way that we've seen, for example, France being much more critical now of Israel?
Yeah, I would say 3 or 4 weeks. That's pretty much what the Biden administration has told the Israelis, that this phase of the military operation where, they have large numbers of ground troops involved in an invasion that's trying to hold territory, that I think we were giving them another 3 or 4 weeks on that. And after that, we do expect them to transition to a much more targeted approach that will take much greater care over civilian casualties and allow for much more humanitarian assistance in. So I think that's roughly the time frame that we're working on. We'll see if the Israelis will agree to that, though, because in my experience, they'll do whatever they think is best for their own national security, regardless of what anybody else thinks. So I think we could be headed to a little bit of a conflict between the United States and Israel in the weeks ahead.
But I mean, we sit here, you in your room lined with books, and me in my warm studio, we talk about 3 or 4 weeks. There's catastrophic hunger, the risk of famine, civilians dying in the tens of thousands. It's hard for people to stomach that, isn't it? That casual talk of 3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult thing for people to understand. And I think it's a very difficult position for the United States to sustain politically here and then internationally, because people really don't understand why people are continuing to be killed at the levels at which they are in Gaza Strip. All I can say is that from the United States perspective, we share Israel's ultimate objective here, which is to make sure Hamas can no longer pose a threat to Israeli civilians. How we get from here to there, I think, is going to be a subject of increasing contentiousness between the United States and Israel. Honestly, I think we're seeing a Bibi's politics, Prime Minister Netanyahu's politics in Israel are really, they're driven by the right wing, and they would like to, they don't care how many Palestinians are killed. They just want to destroy Hamas. Right. And in the United States, we have President Biden, who's getting increasingly criticized on the left for this, and I think is very sensitive to the possibility of regional war and to the fact that the international community seems to be squarely against us. So I think that there's some imperatives on both sides that are gonna clash into each other in the next few weeks.
Frank Lowenstein, thank you very much for joining us.